Hi, this is Nicole Rivera, and you're listening to the Stop Writing Alone podcast. Earlier this year, I finally got started on something that I've been wanting to do for quite some time in the Stop Writing Alone community, and that is start to develop a conversation and process around critiquing each other's work that deviates a bit from the workshop model that has been popularized for decades now through the Iowa Writers writing program. You may recall that I got into reading a couple of books that were sort of on this topic. That's Craft in the Real World by Matthew Salesses, and the Anti-Writing Workshop, which is by Felicia Rose Chavez, I believe. I'm trying to find my book on the bookshelf. I don't see it right now. Anyway, both of these books sort of got to the source of what was the problem with the rule of silence and the traditional writing workshop in a way that I couldn't readily identify. I knew that when I experienced that process, it wasn't fitting for me, and I couldn't necessarily identify why. But once I read those two books, they both spoke to me very clearly. And so I created, back in February, our first ever critique crew in Stop Writing Alone, which is a group of people that are coming together to try to translate what we've learned from reading Craft in the Real World. We just took on one of the books for now, into practice to say, well, what does a critique workshop look like on the other side of this? And so we've gotten started, and the experiment has begun, and the model that we're working with right now is following kind of closely to what Matthew Salesses discussed doing in his writing courses. And that is that we are sharing work with each other in conjunction with writing notes that we're writing about that work. And then what we're receiving from our critique crew, essentially, is margin notes on that work, a great conversation in a group about that work, and then peer letters. And I'm going to explain to you what each of these things are. But today's episode, I really want to talk about one of the first components, and that is the writing notes that we create in the first step, because this has been something that was a lot of fun for me and a great inspiration for me, as this week that just passed was my first time in the hot seat where it was my writing that was being critiqued by the critique crew. So when it comes to critique, I've said this on the podcast and in community many times before. I have very much been a longtime believer that you don't bring a piece into critique to get feedback until you've at least made it to the end of your first draft, until you've reached that finish line, have a solid idea of where you're going with the story, and then you bring it into a critique group to get feedback. Now, my reasons for thinking that was that I had done the opposite before and felt like I lost my way with where I wanted to go because I got so much information from other people that were going in different directions from what I intended. It's just like I felt very insecure about sharing work, and not losing my own way with it if I shared it too soon. I also felt like with one of my works, I'm thinking back to my local writing group, I started writing, and immediately, like as I was in chapter 1, we had our meeting, I brought chapter 1, and then I wrote chapter 2, and then I brought chapter 2, and what ended up happening was, as a result of the meetings where we critiqued, I wanted to go right back into chapter 1 and chapter 2 and rewrite them instead of moving forward. So there were these two big things that were working against me. One was that I was fearful that I would lose my way and my original intention with the work. And the other one was that I would get lost in that cycle of revision of this one part and never move on. So when we read Craft in the Real World, I was really surprised that at the end of the book, I wish he would have mentioned it sooner. At the end of the book, Matthew Salesses discusses the idea of critiquing unfinished drafts. And I was like, whoa, what? All of this is about that as well. And so when it was my turn to be critiqued, I was like, okay, I'm going to put this to the test. I'm going to put this whole new idea of receiving critique on something that is unfinished through this new model and see what happens. Now, part of the argument for bringing an unfinished piece to critique is that critique is happening in a different way now. It is not that I am silently sitting and receiving feedback and just accepting it. It's that we are in a conversation when we're in the group about the work. So immediately, if something starts to go in a way that is not where my story was going, I can say, that's not what I'm doing here. Thank you. And I see what but that's not it. And so, the person that is saying it would be, oh, okay, so that's what I thought. But if that's not what you're doing, we finish. We're not having that conversation. The other thing is that with this new technique, we're not necessarily looking for suggestions. We're looking just for questions. And the goal of this critique conversation is to get the writer to think more deeply about their work. So the role of everyone doing the critique is to ask the questions that drive us to think in that way. But one of the tools that is in place in this process to guard against this even before the conversation begins is this idea of writing notes. So writing notes are basically when I present a piece for a critique group to read, along with that piece, I write probably about a page. Mine went a little bit longer. I apologize to the group for that. Probably about a page that is explaining your intention for the work, so that before anyone even gives you feedback, they are on the same page as you are, even if they're only reading a single chapter or a piece of your work. There's no sort of caveat of like, I'm not sure where you're going with this, but this chapter had me thinking about this. The writing notes answers that question for the readers and tells you where you're going with it. So how do we create writing notes? I want to do this episode this week because I feel like the writing notes in and of themselves are such a powerful tool just to have alongside a work anyway, that even if you're not ready to go to a critique group or you don't have a critique group, I think it's a really good idea to sit down and do a brief writing notes on your current work in process. So what did I do for my writing notes? Real simple. First, because it was going to a critique group, I thanked everybody for reading my work. But then I introduced the story. What's the title? If there is a working title, what is the intended length? Is this a short story, a poem, a novel or novella? So we're already getting some intention right there. You are seeing these 1,000 words, but this is a piece of a longer story. Or this is it. This is the whole story. Here you go. Just basic introduction like that. You may also want to include, if it's genre fiction, what genre it's in, or what category you think you are writing for, or what audience you're writing for. That's a brief introduction And again, that's like a sentence or two, nothing really big. You just want to hone in and answer these questions for yourself. What is your intention with your story? Do you have a working title? Do you know how long this story is going to be right now, or at least what you're aspiring it to be? Then I got into what inspired the story. Where did this all come from, this idea? For me, for this particular story that I shared this week, it was a combination of a prompt and an idea that has sort of been haunting me forever, plus a personal theme that I've been wanting to tackle in my fiction for a while. So it was like the unification of these two things. This particular story I actually started drafting as part of the 52 stories in 52 weeks. So I shared that with the community so that they understood that when I started drafting, I thought this was going to be a short story, something that I wrote in a week. But as I started drafting, realized it had a much bigger role to play. And so all of that was in my section on what inspired the story. And then I got to my next paragraph, which is the process so far. This is really a great thing to sort of keep note of for yourself as a writer, but also if you are going to bring your work into a conversation with other writers, letting the writers know the things that you've already tried or have been dancing around with is really great fodder for that conversation, but also, again, grounds all the writers in where this conversation is going, what questions you may still have. So things that worked for my process so far, again, I had already begun discussing this in the previous paragraph, but the idea that I started out as a short story and then started to extend it. I was thinking about different ideas of where the story could go. I was thinking about in this particular story, a certain disease that my character may or may not be diagnosed with, and whether or not I wanted to do research on that or pull back. I discussed how I thought at one point I might be using tense as a tool, writing some parts in present tense and some parts in past. And, if they saw that as they were reading, did it distract? Did it add to it? Or was it just flowing nicely? Those were some of the things that happened in the process part that, if somebody is reading this story and they're like, wow, I feel like the tense is jumping around, and be like, what the heck was going on with Nicole? When they get to the writing notes, they can say, oh, I see. So maybe she's trying to do something with this. In this paragraph, it's not working. It totally distracted me from reading. So, but at least they have a sense of why something like that is happening, right? And then I concluded the writing notes with the questions and the concerns that I had about the work. This way, that could give the readers a sort of focus on what to look for, not look for, what types of things they might want to discuss with me when it came time for the conversation. Those questions and concerns are really important to write down for yourself too, because you just want to not lose focus. Now, all of these things are things that you may have in notes all over the place for your writing. You may have a plot or outline that has all of this for you. And if you do, and it is all in one place and you know where to find it, then that's fine. I'm just saying, as somebody who is a pantser and does not plot out their stories, this is not something that I necessarily have all in one place. I usually have a notebook that is associated with a project, and it will be there, but sort of scattered throughout the pages, like when an issue comes up, and I'm sort of flipping through to try to remember what's what. But taking the time to sit down and write these writing notes and put all of these ideas into one piece and try to get it down to one page of, what is this story and where do I think it might live someday? Where did it come from? Because the idea of that, what inspired it, and the reason why it's so great to capture that is, we all know, especially with longer pieces, or it's not even longer pieces. It's like the longer you spend with a piece. A short story could be something you work on for years, right? But the longer you sit with a piece, there are those moments that it can become tiresome. So always having a reminder of what inspired it and what excited you about the story is really important. So writing that down while you remember it is great to have in this one page sort of summary. The process so far, that's going to change and grow as you go on. But having bulleted notes or some way of just sort of capturing that for yourself is, I don't know, I just think that's really wonderful. Yes, we could always do our what is it called when the program sort of captures the edit history and you can roll back. That is tiresome to look at over and over again. So summarizing your process so far and the big ideas that you had while you were going along, I think is a great sort of time capsule, but also tool. And the questions, you need to answer these questions for yourself. You need to revisit the concerns that you have about your piece. So why not have a place where you write all those things down? So this was part of my process to bring my writing to Critique Crew this past week. But it was also, I believe, something that just is helping me reconnect with this piece on a different level and come to it with some more clarity even before I received my feedback and had the conversation on Monday. When we've been going around Critique Crew and a couple of other writers have said, I can't wait for my turn, but I don't know what piece I should bring in for critique. I have some short stories. I have a piece of a novel. I don't know what is the one that I want to bring here. And I said to them that my decision was made simply because I asked myself, which piece do I want to write writing notes about right now? And that was this one piece that I brought to the group, and the process was so rewarding. And I look forward to doing it again with another piece. But right now, even from the moment I did the writing notes, I was so excited to get back into the piece. Then getting my conversation and the critique and having that conversation with 6 other writers that were, for once, as fully steeped in the story as I was. You see, all of this stuff, all of this Stop Writing Alone stuff and everything was inspired by, yes, my connections with communities online and things like that. But when I did Pitch Wars back in 2016, and I received a mentorship with a published author to go through my novel of Girl Unplugged, I had never had an experience like that before, where I had a one-on-one conversation with someone else that was writer-minded, that all we did was talk about my story, and he had read, all the pages that I had given him. So he had a sense of where it came from, where it was going. I had written a query letter that sort of gave a little bit of the background and the idea of what the story was about. But then we had conversations about, well, what do you really want to be writing about? Do you want this to be a YA, or do you want this to be middle grade? What is the theme that you're really looking to explore in this? Those sorts of questions and that conversation that went on for a couple of months was like nothing else I had experienced so far in my writing. And I wanted to bring that to writers everywhere, because that's the type of conversation you should be having about your work. Not a sit silently while a room of writers tells you where they found errors in your work, or give you ideas that aren't relevant to the story that you are trying to write. None of that sort of made sense to me as I started to look into how does critique really work outside of pitch wars? Like what is already out there? This conversation that I had on Monday about my work was finally getting back to what inspired this all. Everybody's on the same page. Everybody has almost as much information as I do about this story because they've read my writing notes. And then whatever was confusing or they didn't know, they asked me. And I was there to say either, oh, I'm hoping to do this. This is my plan for this character. Or I don't know yet. That's one of the things that I don't know. That's a great question. Let me write that down because that is a question I should answer. Or thanks for asking that, but that's not a question that I think I want to answer in this story. So really, really quite wonderful. But really this episode is to talk about writing notes and what they are. I do want to continue this conversation here on the podcast about the entire process. So next week, I will return to discuss what the conversations look like, what the rules are that we have made up thus far. We're not really solid on, is this the final product? And also I want to return and talk to you about how we write a peer letter. What do those letters look like that I'm writing when I'm reading somebody else's work? What kind of feedback or conversation are we having there? How does that differ from the live Zoom call when we're all in community talking about the piece we read? And what is our process for doing this beginning to end? It's been wonderful. We've been doing it for 3 weeks now. I was the third writer up. So I had 2 weeks where I was a reader of other people's work and in conversation and then writing a peer letter. And then this past week, like I said, I was on the hot seat. So I just had to share my writing and my writing notes. And I received 6 peer letters about that work and had an amazing conversation on Monday about it. So, it's been great so far for me, and I'm looking forward to inviting more people into this process. But for now, you can begin by giving yourself about an hour to write your writing notes on whatever your work in process is right now. Open up a Google Doc or Word doc or wherever you do your word processing, and you're going to write you can write yourself a nice little letter introducing your story. Again, basic stuff, title, category, genre if you have it, length that you're hoping for. Then get into what inspired the story. Where did it all begin for you? What are the things that maybe you want to tackle? The big ideas, little ideas. Maybe it's just a character you want to explore or a setting. All that stuff that inspires it. Throw that into a paragraph. And then what have you done with it so far? What has been your process? What revisions have you done, or are you just drafting? And finally, conclude with your questions and concerns that you have about this story so far, or potentially concerns that you have for where it's going. And just give yourself that gift of writing notes. And if you have a writing community where you are doing critique and sharing work with each other, I challenge you to not only share your writing with each other, but to share these writing notes with each other when you do so. It will change the conversation. It's so worth the time, so worth the effort. But that's it for me for now. I have to go check my folder and see if our next writer has submitted her work in writing notes so that I can start reading and diving into our next critique conversation for next week. Thank you as always for listening, and have a lovely week.